assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
We are happy to be able to meet with you today, thanks to UC Television, also thanks to the Environmental Studies program, the Department of Black Studies, of Geography, of Sociology, the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, and most of all, the Critical Issues in America series, who provided the funding that made this all possible. I'd also like to invite those of you who are interested in Katrina in particular and the equity issues surrounding Katrina to a similar session, same time, same place, 3 o'clock this coming Monday afternoon, May 1st. Somehow seems appropriate with Katrina, people shouting Mayday, Mayday. But today we have probably America's two leading scholars in environmental justice issues. And I want to start, I'm Bill Freudenberg, by the way, from the Environmental Studies program here at UCSB. And I want to say just about 3 minutes of introduction before I introduce first Bob Bullard and then the second Paul Mohai. Which is to say that way back around Earth Day, there were a few people who seemed to notice that environmental protection was a more serious problem for people whose pocketbooks were thin and whose skin was dark than for rich white people who wore ties. But we pretty much forgot about that. The nation pretty much forgot about that until about 1982 when a then young fellow named Bob Bullard started writing about it. And especially 1987 when Ben Chavis and some others published Toxic Wastes and Race, which got a whole lot of people, both in the academic community and the policy community, paying attention to the question of whether we were providing unequal environmental protection. After a very short time, it got to be a big debate, and especially probably the best known scholar working on what I guess I would call now, in retrospect, the other side of the debate, Dr. Anderton of the University of Massachusetts, published a very well-known article in a very prestigious journal, Demography, arguing that really if you did the numbers right, it showed that maybe income made a difference, but that race didn't. Now, the original plan for our whole Critical Issues in America series was to invite people from all sides of an issue to discuss the topic, and we actually invited Dr. Anderton to come join us, and he said, well, actually, the person who's doing the best work now is Paul Mohai, who just happened to be the second person that we invited for today. So rather than giving you competing points of view today, I think we're going to be giving you, not by intent, but by fortuitous circumstances, one of those cases where science really does move toward consensus. I think that if even Dr. Anderton says now that Paul Mohai's numbers are better than his numbers, that means that pretty much the debate is over. And you will be one of the first audiences to hear the definitive, or as close to definitive statement as we can get at the present point in time, statements on what is the relationship between environmental justice, race, and class in the United States. Our first of two speakers is Bob Bullard, Dr. Robert Bullard, Clark Atlanta University, the author of many books, including Toxic Waste. I'm blanking out on it, Bob. Dumping in Dixie, which has been assigned for so many of my classes that with Alzheimer's kicking in, I couldn't even think of the title of it. Rather than blow your introduction any further, Bob, why don't I ask you to come up here and do your own presentation? I give you Bob Bullard.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon. I'm Robert Bullard. I direct the Environmental Justice Resource Center at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. And before joining the faculty and starting the center, I was a sociology professor at UC Riverside down the road. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I'm proud to say that I am an environmentalist. If you look at the work that has gone on over the last 25 years, you'll see that that environmental justice was not always a term that was understood or even given any respect. So my presentation is the quest for environmental justice, human rights, and the politics of pollution. As a matter of fact, the title of the presentation is actually taken from the title of my most recent book. Not a plug, not a commercial. But when you look at the various books that I've written, some of them deal with housing, some deal with transportation, community economic development, health, access to jobs and employment, the issue of sustainability, sprawl, smart growth, regional equity. These are all different books, but it's the same book, but don't tell anybody. When you talk about this whole question of environment and how we define environment, for a long time the environment was considered this place out there. And what the environmental justice movement attempted to do is to bring in the various components. The environment is everything, where we live, work, play, go to school, worship, as well as the physical and natural world. So that covers a whole lot. It doesn't leave a whole lot, it doesn't leave a whole lot out. And so when we talk about this whole question of environmental justice and the principle of environmental justice, it embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental laws, housing laws, transportation laws, civil rights laws, etc. And so when you start converging environment, human rights, civil rights, the right to have a clean workplace, the right to have food that's safe and healthy, and access to health care, insurance, etc., you start getting out of the more traditional realm of environment that we generally may think of to dealing with social issues and equity issues. And so what environmental justice does, it brings it all together under one tent. If you look at this whole question of the various components and the various organizations that are out there doing environment work, and whether it's in government or whether it's in non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, environmental groups, conservation groups, faith-based organizations, etc., I think it's important that you understand that the various areas that environmental justice really, the areas that it touches, really had a lot to do with its foundation, its roots. And environmental justice came out of a social justice, social equity, human rights component. One of the first books that Sierra Club books did that dealt with people was a book that I kind of like forced, well, I didn't force, I forced the Sierra Club to publish. This is back in 1992. Michael Fisher and I were on the board of directors of Friends of the Earth, and at one of our board meetings, I approached him and said, Michael, Sierra Club, they really do great coffee table books. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, it's time for Sierra Club, they've been around since the 1880s. It's time for them to do a real book about struggle, about justice, about equity. And he wanted to know, what do you mean? And I said, I explained to him. He said, do you have anything? I gave him a two-pager, and he said, when can you get this to me? I FedExed it to him, that it was like Friday, they had it on Monday. That's how that book came out. And you have to do what you have to do, and Sierra Club people, members, read their books religiously. And Sierra, you know what I'm saying. And so if a book that comes out from Sierra Club, and it must be a Sierra Club book. My most recent book, The Quest for Environmental Justice, Human Rights, and the Politics of Pollution, is a follow-up to the Unequal Protection book. I mean, the book was so, well received that they said, okay, let's do it again, 10 years later. And I said, okay, and we did it. The whole question of how do we bring sustainability issues, the issue of precaution, the precautionary principle, the issue of fairness. How do you bring the science into a lot of those arenas? And oftentimes when we talk from the standpoint of locally unwanted land uses, or LULUs, or the siting of polluting facilities, whether it be a landfill, incinerator, or petrochemical plant, or whatever, in most cases, it has very little to do with the hydrology or the toxicology or the epidemiology in terms of siting. The only science in many cases that's involved is political science and sociology. Who gets what, when, where, and why, and the power imbalances that push, the power imbalances that really push those things that other people don't want into what we call the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance historically have been poor people, working class people, and people of color, and people without political power. When you get those combinations acting, you get, a quadruple whammy, and you get those what we call vulnerable communities or sacrifice zones. And so when we talk about addressing equity or addressing inequities, we're talking about not just looking at the things that are bad, the negatives, the externalities, but also the distribution of the things that are good. I've found in many cases in a lot of communities that I've studied from coast to coast and lots of places in between that poor communities have a disproportionate share of the negatives, the bad stuff, and have a shortage of the good things, shortage of libraries, shortage of grocery stores, full-service grocery stores, shortage of sidewalks, parks, green space, those things that most middle-income communities take for granted. And we know there is a relationship between health and the physical environment. And so when we talk about all those things, how we bring the issue of equity into it, the environmental justice movement that may have started initially as an anti-toxics, anti-waste facility siting movement has expanded to encompass where we live, work, play, worship, go to school, as well as the physical and natural world. And so when we talk about the issues that I'm dealing with now, and I'll give you the short version, and you can wait for, you don't have to wait for the book. The book is out, but you may have to wait for the movie. But key questions are, do government officials respond differently to emergencies in people of color communities and white communities? And the emergencies that we're talking about include industrial accidents, environmental contamination such as Superfund, natural disasters such as earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes, bioterrorism threats, epidemics, health epidemics like bird flu and SARS and all those other things. Do people of color and whites have different perceptions of fairness in regard to emergency response to health and environmental emergencies? In other words, the world in black and white. And in some cases, in most cases, the world is not in black and white. There are shades in between. Because of the complexity of our society, most things in this world are not just clear. There are various nuances. And so if you are in a world where there are various shades of red, yellow, black, brown, white, and the world that's imposed and superimposed on you oftentimes will be jaded or will be colored by your own experiences and your own cultural and subcultural groups, and the way that you have been socialized. Third issue, what strategies are needed to address pre-existing social and environmental vulnerabilities that are often worsened by disasters and health emergencies that include natural as well as man-made? And so just flip back to 1978 when I got involved, and I was pressed into duty. 2 years out of graduate school, I was asked to collect data on a lawsuit, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management, which was filed by my wife. And she sued. I was working for a state university in Texas, Texas Southern University, a predominantly black university, historically black university. Just like me saying when my family is predominantly black. This is all black university. And so she asked me to collect data for this lawsuit. She had just sued the state of Texas, and my employer. I'm a junior sociology professor, no tenure, and so she sued my employer. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And so she sued this company. I'm not going to call any names, but the initials are BFI. They were headquartered in Texas, and she said, Bob, this community has come to me, and it's a suburban, middle-class community of homeowners in Houston. So this company wants to put this sanitary landfill in the middle of this community. And I said, yes, and you should know that there's nothing sanitary about a landfill. This is a garbage dump. You can call it whatever you want to call it. And the name of the landfill was Whispering Pines Sanitary Landfill. And so the idea was to, this is 1979 when she filed this lawsuit, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management. This was the first lawsuit that used the civil rights laws to challenge environmental discrimination. And so this is, you know, this is like, there was no roadmap. And I had 10 graduate students in my research methods class, and we started to collect this data and started my way on the road to doing this work. And the issue then was very clear, is that this was a landfill that was put in the middle of this predominantly black community of homeowners. And the street that which the landfill was located on did not have sidewalks. The truck was running up and down the road, kids walking up and down the road. You know, these are elementary schools. There were 7 schools that was within a 1-mile radius of this landfill. And the fact that it was so close to the schools is that I'm standing on the 50-yard line, and I took a picture of the landfill. And if I have that laser pointer, yes. This is a 50-yard line, and this is a landfill mound rising, you know, above the trees. Now, this is Houston, Texas, and it gets hot in Houston, some people say. No air conditioning. The windows are up at the schools. It's hell. It's hell. If you don't know what garbage smells like in 95-degree heat and 96% humidity, no air conditioning, so it impacts learning. So it's not just an environmental issue, a health issue, it's also an educational issue. And so when I was doing this study in 1979 and got it published in 1983, and along the way, there was this other struggle that was taking place in Warren County, North Carolina. People contacted me, and we started to collaborate, we started to work together. This is a PCB landfill that was put in this middle of this black community. They used the best science to locate it. They found North Carolina has 100 counties. And it just so happened that they found one of the poorest and one of the blackest counties in North Carolina to put it. It was the best place to put it. That's what was told. At the time, you know, that this landfill was in the middle of the media, you can see these young students, you know, that have put their lives in front of these trucks. And you can see the North Carolina state troopers that are keeping the kids away and trying to keep order. You know, this is a photograph that was taken in 1983, and I said, this is such a great photograph, this should be on a book. And that photograph was on Dumping in Dixie. I went back there 21 years later to find out what happened, and it took 21 years for the state of North Carolina to clean up the mess that it created. It was a state dump. And every study, every scientific analysis said that that facility would leak. And it did leak. And it did contaminate the groundwater. And North Carolina came back later on and detoxified. They didn't make it whole. They did spend $18 million. But the fact is that that particular dump created economic hell for that county. This county still does not have a hospital. People have to drive 15, 20 miles to get to a hospital. And so it cannot attract any industry. It is still very poor. And so when we talk about these issues, we talk about race, we talk about toxics, and the relationship, and the studies have you know, come and gone about whether or not it's race or whether or not it's class or whether or not it's a combination of both. But people on the ground will tell you that they don't have running water, they don't have sewers, they don't have roads, they don't have street lights, they don't have sidewalks, they don't have the basic amenities that most communities would take for granted. And then they get landfills, then they get garbage dumps, then they get hazardous waste facilities. And then somebody will ask, well, is it because you got all these negative things, or is it because you are the best place to put it based on objective science? And so the idea emerged to say, let's study this. Let's look at this systematically. And so when we talk about the impetus for changing this paradigm, there were so many groups out there wanting help, needing assistance from coast to coast. Native American reservations being dumped on. Latino communities up and down, along the U.S.-Mexican border, in the barrios. Communities in the South, we call dumping in Dixie. And big cities, south side of Chicago, in Harlem, and in other places, Detroit. Same issues. And people will say, well, why is it happening to us all the time, over and over again? Is there a book that the government and industry are reading to say, okay, you deserve to have the landfill? When you open the envelope and the winner is, you're the winner. And so people will say, people are very suspicious. They didn't have any money, any resources to hire people to do studies. That's where environmental justice scholars and researchers and analysts, planners came in. And in 1991, we held the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. We had 1,000 people. We planned it for 500. 1,000 showed up. And anytime you have 1,000 people in Washington, at a summit, you have to have a demonstration. That's just protocol. And so the fact is that we basically designed, developed the meeting, and we developed 17 principles of environmental justice. The first principle is that people must speak for themselves. If you are a grassroots community that's on the fence line, on the front line for toxics, you have a right to sit at the table with government officials and industry to say what happens. And you should not have to have a mouthpiece, a lawyer, or a scientist, or a sociologist, or a professor to speak for you. You should have the information so that you can speak for yourselves. So this whole idea of a summit, this idea of community-based organizing, grassroots, bottom-up, participatory research, community-based research, community-driven research, came out of many struggles that were occurring across the country. And it actually trickled all the way up to the White House. And on February 11, 1994, President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898. And that order basically looks at two basic pieces of legislation: National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that talks about equal enforcement of our laws and non-discrimination if federal money is being used. And in that case, there are a few of us that were invited to the White House in February. It was very snowy, very cold, and Clinton signed the executive order in the Oval Office. That's the only time I've ever been in the Oval Office. I haven't been invited back since 1994 for some reason. I don't know why. But the issue of getting the information, getting it right, and having very smart people do the research. And we were able to convince the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences to conduct a study on environmental justice and health. And the National Institute of Medicine's, IOM, Institute of Medicine of the National Academy, did a study, did their report, and published it in 1999. They basically found what we found, that there are certain populations, low-income and minority populations, that suffer from environmental health, that suffer from diseases that stem from environmental problems in greater numbers than anybody else. As I said, not rocket science, but all the common sense, as my grandmother would say, is not always so common. But we wanted to have very smart people from the National Academy saying it, what we're saying, because it's not enough to have Bob Bullard saying it. It's not enough to have Paul Mulhey saying it, or other environmental sociologists saying it. We have to have people who are in the National Academy and who have positions that people listen to, because we know nobody listens to us. There are some communities that's basically on the wrong side of the tracks. We know this. Physically, geographically, spatially located on the wrong side of the track, and they get all the things that other people don't want. Now, if you talk about does fairness matter, if you live on the wrong side of the track, and if you happen to be one of the residents in those areas, fairness does matter. It matters if we are now so focused and so concerned about homeland security and the possibility of a terrorist attack. And bioterrorism is a real threat. And as a matter of fact, people ask, will the government, will health providers, will first responders be fair if there is a major threat? That is not a hypothetical question. That is not a rhetorical question. That's a real, legitimate question. And if if measures are taken that involve isolation or quarantine or travel restrictions or locking people up in certain areas, people will ask, are they doing it to us because we are on the wrong side of the track, we are the wrong complexion for protection, or is it because we are expendable, or is it because we have been contaminated and we are being quarantined to keep the disease or the problem isolated? And so when the 2001 anthrax attack occurred in Washington, D.C., there was differential treatment of the senators and their Senate staff, which is mostly white, predominantly white, and the people who work in the post office, Brentwood Post Office. And we know who work in the post office, most places. In D.C., this is mostly black. There were 2 postal workers that died. And the fact is that the government waited a long time to do what it needed to do in order to isolate the anthrax in the post office, as opposed to acting swiftly for people in political power and the staffs, etc. Night and day treatment. So the question still remains, if bird flu or some other major threat occurs in certain areas, in major cities, major metropolitan areas, will first responders respond in a way that is non-discriminatory, or will they treat all communities the same? Now, when we talk about this whole question of vulnerable population and vulnerable communities and vulnerable chemical plants, all kinds of government studies from GAO, EPA, shows that there are a lot of chemical plants, 15,000 or more, that are still insecure, and that there are lots of plants that offer so much danger that over 1 million people are at risk in the worst case scenarios. And so the people who live fence line in most places across the country, including California, most of the people who live fence line with these chemical plants that pose the greatest risk are working class people, low income people, and people of color. There are also people who are vulnerable in terms of their ability to escape certain disasters, people who do not have cars, people who are sick, people who are elderly, disabled, who are non-drivers. So when we talk about vulnerability and we talk about equity, all those things go into not only just about landfills, but also about something as dangerous as an attack on a chemical plant by a terrorist, and God forbid. We had lots of examples to show that first responders and government has responded very differently depending on which population groups that are evacuated first. 1995 in Bogalusa, Louisiana. Tank car explodes, first responders come in, evacuate the community that are mostly white first. A couple of days later, they evacuate black people. And people said, no, this is not right. And there are lots of case studies like this. Anderson, Alabama. I'm going to call names because these chemical companies are located, in many cases, right on top of communities. And the problem is not that communities are getting jobs. In many cases, they don't even get the job. They get pollution. And they also get sick. So when we talk about communities that are fighting environmental injustice, and while in some cases debates rage, is it race or is it class? Well, if PCBs and TCE, if those chemicals are making people sick, and if those people are poor, and if they are Hispanic or African American or Asian or white, when it comes to the chemical doesn't care if it's race or if it's class. The people are just as sick. So when people call me and I don't parachute into any community uninvited. As a matter of fact, I don't parachute anymore. I'm an ex-Marine. I don't do that anymore. I take Delta. And I fly in, hit the ground, they drive me around, I see what's happening. But I've seen so many communities that are so impacted. People are sick, and there's no explanation as to why they're sick other than the fact that in some cases they're drinking poisoned water. There's a case right now I'm working on as an expert witness in Tennessee. This is a case where this county, Dixon County, which is like 4.5% black, it has put all of its landfills, all of its toxic waste dumps in the middle of this one little community. And it brought this company in and, to provide jobs, in the 60s. And this company dumped TCE in the landfill. It leaked and got in the wells. And EPA, the federal EPA, and the state Department of Environmental Quality knew about the contamination of these wells, this family's wells, as early as 1988. And they wrote them a letter and said, okay, your well is fine, drink the water. But in 1993, they found TCE in the spring of this white family. And immediately, they told the family, don't drink the water. We'll dig another well. That well got contaminated. We'll put you on city water. And immediately, they put them on city water. But it was only 7 years later that the black family was given the same information and told, don't drink the water, TCE's in the well. And the black family filed a lawsuit. The fact is that everybody in that family has some type of disease, cancer, learning disability, immune deficiencies. If you look at the toxicological profile and the health impacts of TCE, I mean, they're all in that family. Now, so the problem is that the government, this is the well that was contaminated, and they put a lock on it. Here's the kicker, and we did a GIS analysis. And not very sophisticated to know that the black family is 54 feet from the landfill. I mean, you don't need arc view, land view to figure that out. And what we did is we got all the addresses of all the county commissioners and the city council. And on average, these elected officials live 5.5 miles away, 5.5 miles away as opposed to 54 feet. Two of the county commissioners live 15 miles away. They're making decisions about whether or not this family should receive compensation for the fact that this landfill has poisoned their wells. They did not notify them. They treated the family differently. This is discrimination, and it's also contamination lawsuit in terms of health. Oh, you can see how close it is. I'm standing in the yard of the Hope family, and this is the basketball goal, and this is the landfill. So when you talk about these issues, and you talk about the disparities, and you talk about the dangers, the path of least resistance, this is another case I got to call on. This is January 6, 2005. This is a case where two trains collided in a little town called Graniteville. And we know that when trains collide, that's not good. And what happened is that the first responders in Aiken County, the first responders, mostly white people, mostly white men, fire department, sheriff's department, went and they relocated, evacuated the families that lived, that they knew, mostly white, at it's like 3-something in the morning, 3:39 in the morning. They evacuated the white families. But the fact is, that's a train wreck. The fact is that they left some families behind. And the families that were left behind, these are mostly black families who lived in a little segregated area of the community. And the fact is that some of the respondents said, we didn't know that people lived in those down the little alleys. 13 hours later, this is chlorine plume, just wafts through the area. And so the idea is that some people get left behind for some reason. Is it because they are poor? Is it because they are black? Is it because their community somehow is on the wrong side of the tracks, literally and physically? This is a case that happened after Katrina. I'm going to get to this. This is in January. This is after Katrina. This is Baytown, Texas. ExxonMobil, the world's largest petrochemical company. I'm going to call names because I have tenure. ExxonMobil had a spill, had a leak. And, and it just sent this gas throughout this little public housing project. And the public housing project sits fence line to the community. Mostly African Americans and mostly Latinos that live in the project. They are mostly poor people. So it's mostly poor and mostly people of color. You can see how close it is. It sits on top of the community. The fact is that the company, as soon as the community started calling and complaining, The company came out, wiped the spill up, cleaned it up, planted new grass around the swings and the playgrounds, and to notify the Texas department that deals with environment 24 hours later. 24 hours later. The people in Harris County environment, which Harris County is where Baytown is in, they didn't find out about it until 3 days later when they read about it in the Houston Chronicle. So late. And so this was after Katrina. This is not isolated. This is the fact that in many cases across the country, public housing sits in close proximity to toxic release inventory facilities, very dangerous facilities. These are poor people who generally do not have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of options, and they don't have a lot of transportation choices. They generally ride the bus. And if you've ever ridden the bus, you know that in some cases, and particularly in emergencies, the buses generally don't run. And so when you talk about explosions, accidents, this is in Port Arthur, Texas. Our schools are not even safe. There are thousands of school children going to school in schools that are adjacent to, contiguous, next to, in the path line and fence line of dangerous facilities. And many of those schools, as I said before, are poor, and students are children of color, and oftentimes the districts don't have a lot of money to air condition or to make them safe. Playgrounds are not safe. I mean, there's a lot of schools, a lot of playgrounds that have equipment and wood that is still treated with chromated copper arsenic. We know arsenic will kill the hell out of a termite. You know, that's what the wood is treated with in a lot of cases. But a lot of kids are putting their hands in their mouths and taking in the arsenic. It has been banned, but there's still a lot of wood that still has not been taken up and new wood put down. And it happens in mostly poor areas where the parks are at the greatest risk. So we talk about polluted parks, whether it's in Norco, Louisiana, and this is a case where a community that was formed right after slavery on the old diamond plantation in the 1860s, and Shell came in there in the 1940s and sat down right on top of the community. There's an excellent book called Diamond that deals with this. This is not trick photography. This is a playground, and in the background you can see the Shell refinery, that everybody in that community has asthma or respiratory illness or some type of health problem. Am I saying that this company is causing asthma? No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying that what's coming out of the smokestack is not health enhancing. It's not making people feel better. And so when we talk about these issues of air pollution, the cost involved, children spending days out of school, they're getting further and further behind, and going to emergency room, these are big costs. And a lot of the costs that are borne, they're borne by people that don't have health insurance or don't have a lot of money to take off work and to spend on trying to get their kids into hospitals and in to see doctors. And so when we talk about this epidemic, it is not just industries, it's also us. And the fact that we're so into our cars, and everybody, you know, we know that driving is a basic right, and in many cases people believe that it's their constitutional right to pollute and to drive a car. Even the gas is $4 a gallon, and it's their, you know, give me liberty. We know that cars give people liberty, access, mobility, but it also provides a disadvantage if you don't have access to alternative transportation. And we saw this in Katrina, and we saw what happened in terms of vulnerable population, and the most vulnerable population being left behind. Poor people, elderly, disabled, sick people, children, people without cars, transit dependent, non-drivers, and homeless people. When you talk about how evacuees were dispersed all over the map, and the fact that in many cases, if you didn't have a car, you were basically left to fend for yourself, you're on your own. And so when we talk about the issue people being forced to ride out the storm, we know that this was not, you know, the most comprehensive emergency evacuation plan. Most cities, major cities in this country, emergency evacuation plan is still inadequate. They do not plan for people, these special populations. If we had to evacuate Atlanta, for example, we'd be in trouble, particularly in terms of where would you send 100,000 people if there was a major disaster. How would you take them, where would you put them, 100,000 black people, for example, who don't have cars, who are low income? Which county is going to take them in the suburban county? I can't think of a single county that would say we'd take 100,000. They didn't want 10. We have a Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, MARTA. It was supposed to be 5 counties. It ended up being 2. The counties that are majority African American. The surrounding counties said we don't want public transit because MARTA, M-A-R-T-A, stands for Moving Africans Rapidly Through Atlanta. They said, you're going to bring all these black people out? We don't want this. And so they decided not to have MARTA. So everybody's stuck in traffic if you have a car. And MARTA does not go where it needs to go. And so when we talk about the whole issue of lack of transportation, vulnerability, pre-existing vulnerabilities, all these things were known. You know, all of the studies show that there was over 100,000 people in New Orleans that didn't have cars, access to automobiles. Knew this in advance. And so when we talk about automobiles flooded, you talk about public transit flooded, that's criminal. School buses flooded, criminal. And so when we talk about emergency transportation plan, inadequate. There are some people who say we don't have the complexion for protection. Pre-existing conditions. There were communities in New Orleans that were fighting to get cleaned up and to get relocated before Katrina. Been fighting for the last 10 years to get cleaned up. One community called Agricultural Street Landfill Community. This is a community that was built on top of a landfill that was used to dispose of hurricane debris in 1965 after Hurricane Betsy. They put all this hurricane debris in this landfill, then they built these houses on top of it. 1965, and up until 1984, they built these houses. This community has been fighting to get relocated. And there's a school that was brand new state-of-the-art school, had to close because it's built on top of this landfill. All this happened before Katrina. A lot of them were HUD houses because they were subsidized by HUD. Elderly housing and middle-income housing. And so if you talk about preconditions, the fact that there are many communities pre-Katrina in New Orleans where lead poisoned children, neighborhoods, in some cases 60% of the children are lead poisoned. 60%. All these studies were done before. And a lot of it comes from paint in housing, but some of it comes from lead in the soil. And so when you talk about the mother of all cleanups, right now there's a big struggle and a big fight in New Orleans with EPA, federal EPA, and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality saying that some communities were polluted before Katrina, and therefore we don't have to clean them up. So it's safe because it was polluted before Katrina. And we've been saying all along that these neighborhoods need to be cleaned up. There are FEMA blue top roofs being nailed down on housing that's with lead paint. So they'll put roofs on houses, but they won't clean up the lead. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a cancer. So when we talk about these issues, this toxic soup, and the whole issue of people going back to dress their homes, going back to deal with the debris, and dealing with the flooding, dealing with the fact that mold has taken over many communities, houses, and people are going back without proper equipment, proper training. They're getting sick. Mold is very dangerous. There are people going back in these molded houses without respirators, without gloves, without boots, without Tyvek suits, and they're getting sick. And there's a disease called Katrina cough because breathing these mold spores. This is a friend of mine, close friend of mine's house in New Orleans East. Dr. Beverly Wright. We've written a whole lot together. This is a living room, and that's a bedroom. That's a kitchen. You can see the mold has taken over. So the issues are real. These photographs were taken 3 weeks ago in the lower Ninth Ward. This is Mystico. This is the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. That's a barge that broke the levee. These are houses that are flattened. You can see the fact that engineering, or lack thereof, man-made disasters oftentimes exacerbate natural disasters. And so when we talk about the issues, the garbage, the houses, the neighborhoods, community organizations that are coming together, and we talk about the fact that communities are saying, if the government will not do it, we're going to do it ourselves. There's a program called Safeway Back Home that's a partnership between the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice at Dillard University, a sister center like ours at Clark Atlanta. They're working with the United Steelworkers Union and saying there's a way for people to come back home. If the government won't clean up the neighborhoods, the communities will do it. And there's a pilot project in New Orleans East. This is what the neighborhood looked like before the cleanup started. You know, all kinds of debris strewn. This is a black middle-class neighborhood of homeowners. Very, you know, beautiful homes. Homes being gutted. All the rubble, you know, people's lives have been reduced to gutted out homes. You know, their pictures, family pictures. I mean, it's really sad. And the government's saying, well, we don't have a responsibility to clean up the soil in people's yards. And so this pilot project is saying, well, if the government won't do it, then we'll do it. And so the community has gotten together. They've pulled together all kinds of volunteers across the country. Students took their spring break. This is like in March 23rd through the 25th to go down and work and volunteer and take the training and stand with communities to assist. I've never seen anything like it. You know, I've been on this earth 59 years. The outpouring of volunteers from all across the country coming down to work on this project that is basically a community university union project in terms of collaborative. There are even churches that are coming down. I mean, this is a church from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that gutted the homes and is working with communities. And this is hard work. I mean, this is back-breaking work. And you can see after the kids got through doing that job, you know, there's one climbing trees like, great, I'm so glad to be done. The fact is that the government has started to respond by cleaning up, picking up the waste. The steel workers have lots of expertise. They do this kind of work all across the country in terms of cleanup. And so this is a model project, taking bobcats, removing 3 to 4 inches of topsoil that's contaminated with arsenic, lead, with all kinds of petrochemicals that have been left in the sediments by receding floodwaters, and doing what we feel the government should be doing because these people's yards are contaminated through no fault of their own. You can see the work in progress, the new dirt. Even the Red Cross showed up. There are some people that ask, where's the Red Cross? Well, they showed up and provided water and, well, you know, students, every time you get students, 2 of them together, they're going to have to perform. This is before. These are houses in the neighborhood, spreading the new soil. And you can see that the students are in the Tyvek suits. They're in the boots. They're in the gloves. They have the little small mask on. They were given training, you know, training before in terms of protection, what to look for. And so you can see that this was a model project. As I said, it's hard work, but you know, at the end of the day, I think it all paid off, and there's another training, another second phase of it on May 16th. No, I'm sorry, May 6th. That will happen. Again, this is a shot of one of the yards that's done. The side's down, the lawn's being watered. You can see that it's a great experience to see before and after shots. I think I have one shot here, and to see before and after, and to see the difference between what it makes, a difference it makes in terms of getting students involved, getting young people involved, getting unions involved, getting churches involved, getting all kinds of organizations involved when the government says, it's not my responsibility, we don't have any money to do it, it was polluted before, taking a position that once polluted, it should always be polluted. And we say these are basic human rights issues and that should be resolved, and that the government should be moving forward to work with communities, that environmental justice principle, environmental justice paradigm should be the major focus. Precaution. Even if some of the levels do not reach the levels of a Superfund cleanup or a brownfield cleanup trigger, we should take precaution in that we should not have to wait 20 years down the road and people be asking, why didn't the government clean up that mess if the studies were done? These are all questions. There are a lot of questions. There are more questions than answers. But I think the fact that the environmental justice movement has been able to bring together scholars, activists, faith-based organizations, and all kinds of groups together under one tent to do what needs to be done to change this society. Thank you very much.